interesting Gemara today. Very interesting svaras. We are on Daf Samach Daled Amud Aleph at the Mishnah. And we had seen this Mishnah yesterday in the context of trying to understand the Shita of Rav Dimi, that when you use specific language, you are either giving away something or retaining ownership of something upon a sale. So the Mishnah says that when you sell a house, not included in the sale of the house is a subterraneous well that may be underneath the house. So that's what the Mishnah says, lo es habor v'lo es hadus. We'll see momentarily the difference between these two things, but for bor and dus, for our purposes, both being a well. Afal pisha kosav lo umkavaruma. And that's true, like we said yesterday, even if stipulated in the contract, is depth and height. In other words, you have the depths of the house and you have the heights above the house. That does not include the well, because all that means when you say the depths is that you're giving a person digging rights underneath the house, but not to gain access to the water that's in the well. Okay. V'tzarech likach lo derech divrei Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva says that the owner of the house who is now selling the house, let's say Reuven is selling the house to Shimon. Reuven retains ownership of the well. Now, because Reuven is selling the house and the only way to access the well is through the house, how is Reuven going to get to his well? So Rabbi Akiva says it has to be stipulated in the purchase agreement that Reuven has rights of access. And if it's not stipulated, then Reuven, you're out of luck. You can't use your well. If Shimon wants to stop you, he's the owner of the house. So you have to stipulate that in the contract explicitly. And v'chachamim omrim eino tzarech likach lo derech. And the chachamim say no, that's implicit. Even if it's not stipulated, it's implicit that the fact that the seller is holding on to the well means he's also holding on to access rights. Umo de Rabbi Akiva bizman she'omer lo chutz me'elu she'ein tzarech likach derech. Rabbi Akiva will agree. Even though Rabbi Akiva, agree that the buyer is now the sole proprietor of the house unless it's properly stipulated. But nevertheless, if in the purchase agreement it states explicitly that the seller retains ownership of the well, that extra language implies that the owner has access to the well. In other words, you don't have to state that, because even without stating that in the purchase agreement, I'm selling you the house, period, it's clear from the Mishnah that the well is not included in the sale. So why did the seller include that statement, the well is not included in the sale? The Yitor Lashon, the additional language, implies that not only does the seller hold on to the well, but the seller also maintains rights of access to the well. And that we get from the extra language that was extraneous. It was unnecessary. So remember we said yesterday that anytime there's unnecessary language, it means to explain other terms of the sale, and this is one of those terms.
When Rabbi Akiva says likach, it means to purchase it. So he sells the house and he has to purchase back a path?
Correct. He has to purchase the rights of access, meaning in this context he retains rights of access. That has to be explicitly stipulated in the contract. Correct. Now, let's go to the second case. The second case is machron la'acher. Here's the opposite case. Reuven is the owner of the house and the well, and instead of selling the house, he's selling the well and holding on to the house. Now, here you have the opposite dilemma. The buyer can only use the well if he accesses the house, but the house doesn't belong to him. So here again we have this machlokus. Rabbi Akiva omer eino tzarech likach lo derech. Rabbi Akiva says, here just the opposite. Before, Rabbi Akiva said that you have to make the rights of access explicit, because in the previous case it was the seller who wants to be able to access the house. Here, because it's the buyer who wants to access the house, Rabbi Akiva sides with the buyer in both cases, and he says, Eino tzarech likach lo derech. The buyer does not have to explicitly state in the purchase agreement that he has rights of access. That's implicit. V'chachamim omrim tzarech likach lo derech, and the chachamim disagree, and they say no, they side with the seller in both the Reisha and the Seifa, and they say that I sold you the well, but I didn't give you access to my house. So how are you going to get to the well? That's your problem, not my problem. Okay. The Gemara now says, Yosef Ravina v'kakashale. So Ravina was standing and in front of his Rebbe, and he had the following, or sitting, and he had the following question. It says, Hainu bor, hainu dus. He says, what's the difference between a bor and a dus? They seem to be the same thing. They're both wells underground. Amar le Rava Tosfa le Ravina Toshma. So Rava Tosfa says to Ravina, come, let me explain to you. There's a brisa that says, the Tanya echad abor ve'echad adus bekarka, ela she'abor bechafira ve'hadus bevinyan. He says, they're both wells that are underground, that are below ground. What's the difference between the two? A bore is a well that you dig in hard soil so that the walls of the well are the soil itself. And a dus is a well that you dig in soft soil, and without building some kind of structure, a wall in the well, the well would collapse. And so that's what a dus is. But they mean essentially, for our purposes of halachic discussion of ownership and access rights, they mean exactly the same thing. So Yosef, and then the Gemara says we have the same issue that not only was Ravina troubled by the difference, but Ravashi also at one time was as well. Yosef Ravashi v'kakashale hanu bor hainu dus amali mark shisha b'red Rav Chistel Ravashi toshma b'tanya echad abor v'echad adus b'karka el shabor b'chafira v'hadus b'vin. And it's the exact same conversation that instead of Rava Tosfa, it was Mark Shisha who told him that Ravashi, you should know that there's a brisa that tells us that they're the same thing, just one is without a wall and one is with a wall. So the Gemara says we have two machlokos in our Mishnah, both of them between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. In the first case, the owner sells the house. Does the owner have automatic rights of access implicitly? That's according to the Chachamim. But Rabbi Akiva says that you have to, I'm sorry. Okay. But Rabbi Akiva says no. Okay. Rabbi Akiva says Eino Tzarech. So the Gemara now says, My lav b'hakamifli. Let us suggest that the machlokus is as follows. The Rabbi Akiva savar mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher, v'Rabbanan savri mocher ba'ayin ra'a mocher. So let us suggest that the machlokus is as follows. Rabbi Akiva holds that when a person sells a property, he sells it generously. And the Rabbanan hold that when a person sells a property, he sells it in a miserly fashion, or begrudgingly. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Rabbi Korobkin here. Yes, Sarah, tell me what's going on. Well, he should only say that at the time of the Yitzias Neshama. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. The last psukim at the end of the Yom Kippur service. Shema Yisrael, Baruch Shem 3 times, and then Hashem Hu Elokim 7 times. I apologize. Yeah, hi Jeff. I'm giving the Daf Yomi, so I'm going to have to say it quickly. Shema Yisrael 1 time, Baruch Shem 3 times, and Hashem Elokim 7 times. No. Only at the time when the soul leaves. Should I come over after I'm finished with the daf? Okay. I'll be over in just a few minutes. Thank you. Okay. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye. Okay. Let's hear. We should only hear about Besuras Tovas. Okay. Let us go on. Rabbi Akiva holds that when a person sells a property, he sells it generously. So because Rabbi Akiva holds that when a person sells a property, he sells it generously, when I sold you the house, I didn't mean for you to have to give up, your house to let me come and access the well. I gave you the house outright, and therefore, if I want to be able to gain access to your house, I have to be able to explicitly purchase from you rights of access, because I gave the house to you completely with complete generosity. The Chachamim say just the opposite. When I sell you a house, I'm selling it to you in as a begrudging as possible way. So therefore, whatever I can retain as far as my rights, it's implicit that that was my intent. Okay, so that's the machlokas. And if you think about it, that would be the same way of explaining the second case. And that would be the difference, why there's a difference between seller and buyer. That in the case where the Reuven is selling the well and not the house, he's holding on to the house, he's selling the well generously according to Rabbi Akiva, and therefore rights of access to the house are implicit. Of course, when I sold you the well, I generously wanted you to have it, to benefit from it, and therefore I sold you implicitly rights of access to the house. But the Chachamim disagree, and the Chachamim say that it's just the opposite, that I sold you the well begrudgingly, so if you want rights of access, you're going to have to bargain for it, because it's not something that I freely give up. So the Gemara therefore says, if that's the case, Udekamar nami ba'alma Rabbi Akiva l'taime domer mocher ba'in yafa mocher mehacha. That any other place in Shas where we find that Rabbi Akiva says that a person sells generously, and the Gemara cites that Rabbi Akiva all over holds that a person when he sells generously. Where is the source text for that? That's this Mishnah right over here. That's what the Gemara is trying to suggest. Now, where there are other places in Shas, the example that the Rashbam and Tosfos both bring, where we have another case where Rabbi Akiva says that a person sells generously, is something that we saw in the third parak on Daf Lamed Zayin. That was the case where a person, Reuven, owns a field, and on that field is a tree. He sells Shimon the tree. And the machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim is, what happens if the tree dies? Does Shimon have the rights, the land rights where the tree is, to replant or not? So Rabbi Akiva says, of course, when Reuven sold Shimon the tree, he sold him the land rights of the tree also. So therefore, if the tree dies, go ahead and replant. But the Chachamim say no, that Reuven sold it in a begrudging fashion, and therefore, if the tree dies, I only sold you a tree. It was that tree. That tree dies, you're out of luck.
When it comes to this access to that well, the seller can't, the seller can't say to him, you want to offer me money for the derech to the well? I refuse to sell it to you. He can't do that, can he?
I don't know.
How far does this iron
We don't have an indication from the Gemara. It could be that there would have to be some kind of, maybe the Chachamim might coerce him, I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, I can understand him saying, okay, please pay for that.
Right, it would stand to reason that you're correct, because a person can claim, why would I buy something that I can never use? Right. It makes sense what you're saying, but the Gemara doesn't actually discuss that issue.
The language of the Mishnah makes it a secondary clause. I mean, because it says likach, it doesn't say he automatically gets it.
I know, that's the whole point. We're saying that it has to be explicitly written in the shtar.
Yeah, but it doesn't say, right? I'm just saying the language is strange. The language
I hear
of
you.
purchase.
I hear you. I hear
so pay for it.
Right. So the Gemara now says mimai. So the Gemara is now going to challenge the whole premise of what we're just saying. You're telling me that our Mishnah is indicative of this machlokas that Rabbi Akiva holds, a seller sells generously, and the Chachamim say a seller sells begrudgingly. I have a totally different way of looking at this machlokas, not at all. Dilma, and the Bach puts in the words, V'hapligi Rabbi maybe this is the machlokas. Rabbi Akiva savar ein adam rotza she'yitein ma'osa v'yidresu acherim, v'Rabbanan savri ein adam rotza she'yitol mos v'yifrach ba'avir. That the machlokas is very simple. That the issue is like this. There are clearly conflicting interests over here. There's a conflicting interest because, on the one hand, when I buy a house, I don't want people trampling into the house and intruding on my privacy and stepping into my house. On the other hand, the well owner, when he's a separate person, does not want to have to fly in the air in order to access the well. That's the language of the Gemara. So we have conflicting interests. The well owner wants rights of access. The house owner wants privacy. So perhaps the machlokas has got nothing to do with how generous or begrudging a person sells a property, but rather which one of these two conflicting interests is more of a concern, or has more power. Rabbi Akiva says that privacy has more power than access. And the Chachamim say that access has more power than privacy. And that's why in the first case of our Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva says that when Reuven sells the house to Shimon and he retains ownership of the well, he doesn't have rights of access unless it's explicitly written in the shtar, because privacy is more important than access. And the Chachamim say no, access is more important than privacy, so that's implicit. And if he doesn't want him to have access, he'll have to state that in the shtar. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, that can't be, because ve'ela miseifa, look at the second case. Machran la'acher, Rabbi Akiva omer, eino tzarech likach lo derech, v'chachamim omrim tzarech. The Gemara says, but wait a minute, then let's look at the second case. In the second case, where Reuven retains the house and sells the well to Shimon, in just the opposite case, what did Rabbi Akiva say? Rabbi Akiva says the buyer automatically, implicitly has access, and the seller can't stop him unless he puts it explicitly in the shtar. And there the Chachamim say that no, the buyer has to explicitly write it in the shtar. Here it's just the opposite. You can't say that Rabbi Akiva holds that the interests of privacy are greater than the interests of access, because in the second case he says that the buyer automatically has access to the house. So clearly that can't be the issue. But wait a minute, says the Gemara. So my lavga b'hakamiflagi, the Rabbi Akiva savar mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher, v'rabbanan sabri mocher ba'ayin ra mocher. That's what the Bach puts in. So therefore you have to conclude, based on the aggregate of these two cases, that it's a case of that the issue is, does the seller sell generously or does the seller sell begrudgingly? That's the issue. Wait a minute, not so fast, says the Gemara. V'dilma b'hakamifli, b'hapli, b'haipli. The Rabbi Akiva savar basar daita de lokeach azlinan. The Rabbanan savar basar daita de mocher azlinan. Wait, not so fast. Maybe it's not an issue of generosity and not an issue of begrudging or miserliness. You know what the issue is? Really, only in a case of where these two conflicting interests is there a machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. And it's not a question of attitudes of selling or attitudes of buying, but simply there's a machlokas when you have two equally conflicting interests, where one person wants privacy and the other person wants access. Who has the greater claim? In other words, it's not like we were saying before that Rabbi Akiva holds privacy is more important and the Chachamim say that access is more important. But rather, maybe the machlokas is like this. They both agree that these two conflicting interests have equal standing as far as their logical claim, access versus privacy. But who has more power in the claim? Is it the buyer or the seller? That's the issue. So when the seller in the first case, when the buyer in the first case is buying the house, there, Rabbi Akiva holds the buyer's interests are always more important than the seller's. So in the first case, the buyer's interests are privacy. In the second case, the buyer's interests are access. And we always award the interests of the buyer over the seller. And the Chachamim say no. When there's conflicting interests, we always award the seller over the buyer. But it's got nothing to do with their psychology. It's got to do with who has more power in the deal. And maybe that's the machlokas. So therefore, in a situation where you don't have these conflicting interests, like the case of the tree in the third parak, maybe you can't extrapolate from there to here, because there it's a case of generosity versus miserliness, where over here it's just a question of when you have conflicting interests, who has more power. They're not comparable. The elameha. So the Gemara says, you know what, you're right. You can't necessarily infer the whole issue of generosity versus miserliness from here, but rather we're going to see a mission in a few pages on Daf Ayin Aleph, which seems to be redundant. It says, Lo es habor velo es hagas velo es hashobach bein charevin bein yeshuvin. There's a Mishnah that talks about the following case. When Reuven sells his sadeh, when he sells his field to Shimon, what is included in that sale? So the Mishnah says that included in that sale is only the field, but if on that field there is a well, or there is a wine press, or there is a dove coop, or or any of these, apparatuses. So it doesn't matter whether they are active or whether they are defunct. Meaning, let's say the well is dry, there's no vineyard, there's no grapes growing by the press, or there's no birds in the dove coop. Either way, those structures are not included in the sale. And then you have the same machlokas Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. B'tzarach likach lo derech divrei Rabbi Akiva. But Rabbi Akiva says that the seller still has to purchase access rights to the field. And the Chachamim omrim eino tzarech. And the Chachamim say, no, he doesn't. So now, hasu lamali. Elolav hakamashman de Rabbi Akiva savar mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher, v'rabbonin savar mocher ba'ayin ra mocher. Now there too you may have conflicting interests, but it's totally redundant because once I know the conflicting interests ruling as far as their shitas by the case of the house, why do you have to tell me a similar case in the case of a sada? It seems to be the same issues, same conflicting interests of privacy versus access. And so therefore the very fact that this Mishnah is written a second time indicates to me that the issue is something additional, which is when a person sells, does he sell generously like Rabbi Akiva says, or does he sell begrudgingly like the Chachamim say? But wait a minute, not necessarily. V'dilma ashmu'inon bayis v'kamashmalon sadu tzricha. No, maybe you need to tell me both cases because I couldn't infer the case of a field from the house or the case of the house from the field. You know why? Di'i ashmu'inon bayis mishum deboy tzniusa. Aval sadeh imalo. Because if the Mishnah would have only listed the case of a house, maybe only by the case of a house does Rabbi Akiva say that the seller is not automatically entitled to access, because a house is where you do private things. It's not exposed to the public. And therefore it's more understandable why the seller does not have immediate access. But maybe in a Sada, Rabbi Akiva would agree, and that's why you need the next Mishnah to tell me that even in a case of a Sada, Rabbi Akiva holds that the buyer is entitled to the privacy and the seller doesn't have automatic access. And conversely, if the Mishnah had only listed the case of Sadeh, maybe there Rabbi Akiva protects the interests of the buyer because he could claim, I don't want people trampling on my produce. Because in a Sadeh is a place where you grow things, and by you coming in and stepping on my crops, you're going to be destroying my crops. But in a house, there are no crops to destroy. And so maybe that's the reason why Rabbi Akiva feels he needs to address the issue of the buyer's rights in both the house and the field. And therefore, you have no extraneous mission to teach me about generosity versus miserliness. So Ela Miseifa, wait a minute, but there's one other case on Daf Ayin Aleph, which is the opposite case, which is where a guy has a field and he has, let's say, a well on the field. And instead of selling the field, he sells the well. Machron la'acher, if he sells the well to someone else, Rabbi Akiva omer eino tzarech likach lo derech v'chachamim omer tzarech. Same machlokas. Rabbi Akiva says the sale implicitly includes access to the well, and the Chachamim say no, it doesn't. You have to specify it explicitly. So hasu lamali. Why do you need to write that? Hainu hach. It's the same case all over again, and there's nothing additional that I'm learning. Once I know that a field is no different from a house, why then does the Mishnah have to say the second case again, if I already know it applies by a house as well? So elalav hakamash melunder Rabbi Akiva savar mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher v'rabbanan savari mocher ba'ayin ra mocher shmamina. This conclusively proves what we were trying to set out to prove, that the source text is our perek, our discussion of selling and buying, when the seller sells only a limited sale of either the field or the house and not the well, or vice versa, where he sells only the well and not the house. In this very last case of where he sells the well without the field, and we say that according to Rabbi Akiva, the buyer has automatic access to the well, and the Chachamim say he doesn't, that last case is coming to teach me that it's a machlokas having to do with the psychology of the seller. Does the seller sell generously, or does the seller sell in a begrudging fashion? Kamash shmamina. That proves our point. Itzmar. So now the question is, how do we paskin? Rav Huna amar Rav halacha kedivrei chachamim, Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba amar Shmuel halacha keRebbi Akiva. Rav Huna, quoting his Rebbe Rav, says that we paskin like the chachamim, that the psychology of a seller is he sells begrudgingly, and therefore, if it's not explicitly written rights of access to the buyer has no access. Okay, he sells begrudgingly, right? And the Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Amar Shmuel halacha kaRebbi Akiva. And Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, quoting Shmuel, says that just the opposite. We paskin like Rebbe Akiva, that a seller sells generously. So Amalei Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Rav Huna v'Hazimnin Sagin Amrita Kamei de Rav Hilchasa kaRebbi Akiva v'lo ma'amar li v'lo midi. So Rav Yirmiyah is bothered by Rav Huna's citation of Rav. You're telling me that Rav holds we paskin like the Chachamim, but I've told him many times that the halacha is like Rebbe Akiva. I've said it in his presence, in the presence of Rav, and he never corrected me. He never bothered to correct me. So doesn't that prove that he agrees that we paskin like Rebbe Akiva? So Amar lei hechi tanisa. So Rav Huna says to him, wait a minute, Rav Yirmiyah, you told him the halacha is like Rebbe Akiva. Tell me how you quoted Rebbe Akiva. So Amar lei ipcha tanina. So he said to him, he had a version of the Mishnah where the opinions of Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim were inversed. So Rabbi Akiva is the one who says that a person sells begrudgingly, and the Chachamim say that a person sells generously. That was the way that his version of the Mishnah was. That's the way he had learned it. So, says Rav Huna, Mishum hachi lo amar lach v'lo midi. That's why he didn't correct you. He didn't correct you because he agrees with you that the psychology of a seller is to sell it begrudgingly. The reason why he didn't correct you is because what you hold as Rabbi Akiva is what he holds as the Chachamim. And this is where we'll hold it for today. Wonderful. Anyone saying Kaddish?
Yeah.
Rabbi Chanan ben Kasha Omer Ratzah.